control de las cogniciones, emociones y conductas. Entre sus publicaciones destacan, como les comentaba, algunas en torno al efecto de evaluaciones implícitas en comida chatarra y no chatarra, el efecto del distanciamiento social y las relaciones interpersonales durante la pandemia por COVID-19 y muchas otras tantas. La doctora recibió su grado de doctora en la Universidad de Ludwig Maximilian University de Múnich y el Max Planck Instituto de Fisiología Conductual en Alemania. Sus contribuciones más notables se encuentran en el campo de investigación de los peligros del pensamiento positivo y el contraste mental, así como técnicas de autorregulación que son efectivas para sobrellevar la vida diaria. Sin más por el momento, les dejo con la doctora Gabriele.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. I wish I could speak Spanish. I can hardly understand, but I certainly cannot speak. Therefore, I need to wish you good morning. And it is such a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the association and especially our friend Rolando for the invitation. Thank you a lot. Okay, so I want to talk about misplaced certainty, completely different topic than I usually talk about. And this is a very new line of research, which we recently did at NYU. And before I even start my talk, I want to ask you a question. And the question is, do you know someone who knows it all? Who knows how the future will develop, how other people think, and what is right and what is wrong, what is absolutely true and what is not true? And similarly, have you ever yourself known what the future holds? Despite in the back of your mind, you know you can't really with certainty predict the future. Have you ever felt, I know what she is thinking, despite that you perfectly realize that you can't read other people's minds? And have you ever felt, this is right, this is absolutely right, and I know it, despite that you feel there are no absolute truths behind such moral convictions? If you did that, and if you know someone like that, then you might have encountered misplaced certainty. And I want to talk about misplaced certainty, meaning we are certain about things despite that in the back of our minds we know we cannot be certain about, or that other people tell us, you can't be certain about that. And this misplaced certainty will be the topic of our next 55 minutes. Okay, before I go into the content, let me thank the three collaborators with whom I did this work. And I want to tell you, without them, this all would have not come about. So first, it's Anton Gollwitzer, who is now assistant professor at the Business Institute in Oslo, Norway, and is affiliated with the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, Germany. Then it's Jin Zhang, who is a postdoctoral fellow at New York University, and it's Irmak Olkayser-Ogden, who is assistant professor at Florida State University and used to be a postdoctoral fellow at New York University. Okay, what I want to do is I want to show you what is the phenomenon of misplaced certainty. And I want to argue, like I did before, that it's actually in all of us. And then I want to talk about the origins of misplaced certainty. So where does it come from? What are the determinants of misplaced certainty? And then finally, talk about the main point. What are the consequences? And I want to talk about the consequences, especially in terms of fanaticism, that it makes people vulnerable to fanaticism as defined as being aggressive, as being determined to ignore others, and as following extreme groups and movements. Now, what's the phenomenon? Now, the term misplaced certainty comes actually from political science. And in international relations science, Metzen and Schweller would argue that it is not what is commonly assumed in political science, uncertainty, which is the culprit for international conflicts and wars. It's actually certainty. And the certainty can refer to the certainty that other people have ill intentions, other states have ill intentions, or it can refer to that other states are very well intended towards one own state. So what they argue is, in one case, they go into conflict with the ill-intended, assumed ill-intended states. And in the other case, they would say, okay, they don't defend themselves at all. So they reduce the military and are therefore vulnerable for conflicts, for being aggressed by the others. So they say the certainty about the intentions of other states, about the capabilities of other states, or both, is actually making these states vulnerable for these conflicts and wars, and that this certainty persists in light of this confirming evidence. Okay, so we took this term and thought maybe this misplaced certainty also exists in individuals and makes individuals vulnerable for hostility and fanatical behavior. So we define then, very much in line with Misson and Schweller, misplaced certainty as a subjective sense of certainty about something that one perceives as doubted or opposed, either by yourself, that you recognize it yourself, or by most others. Now, this misplaced certainty has two components then. One, that I'm certain that I know things, but then the other component is that in the back of my mind, I'm actually uncertain. I feel I cannot know things. It's recognized as unknowable by oneself or by others. Now, things which are recognized as unknowable are often related to the future, recognized as unknowable, the minds of others, so what other people think, and then also absolute truth. Oh. Okay, good, great, thanks. So examples, I don't want to go into all of them. Examples would be, I recognize that the future is unknowable, but I'm certain that my future will have good things for me. Or I realize that nobody can read other people's minds, but I know what she's thinking. Or I understand that whether God exists or not cannot be known, but I know God exists. Now, the concept of misplaced certainty has long roots. People want to be certain. So in former times, they traveled to the oracles and they wanted to have advice that they can be certain. And then throughout history, conspiracy theories have been prevailing, not only now, they have been prevailing throughout the history. And conspiracy theories are often held with misplaced certainty, so I know there is some secrecy involved. And then the same thing for recent discussions for alternative facts, alternative news, fake news, misinformation. They are often held with misplaced certainty. Now, just to, don't even try to get into that too carefully, but when you have misplaced certainty, it has two components. One component is uncertainty, certainty, which is on the x-axis here. And the other component is well-placed versus misplaced. So well-placed on the top and misplaced on the bottom. Obviously, in that model, you would have misplaced certainty. I'm certain, but my certainty is misplaced. It's the lower right quadrant. Now, the well-placed certainty should be very different, and that's the upper right quadrant. So I'm certain, but I can be certain. And then the well-placed uncertainty as well. So I'm uncertain, but it's also uncertain. So meaning there is no ambivalence between what I know and what is knowable. And these, in the following studies, are our control variables or our control groups. So we want to compare misplaced certainty with other kinds of epistemic structure that are in the well-placed quadrants. Now there's another one, which is misplaced uncertainty. I will not talk about misplaced uncertainty today, despite the fact that this is a very interesting concept, but that's for a later talk. Okay, study set one, we want just to see what is the phenomenon of misplaced certainty. So is it actually as prevalent as we think? And it should be prevalent because we have a desire for certainty. Uncertainty is just painful, it's just uncomfortable. We don't feel well with uncertainty. Certainty is much nicer. And then from the cognitive literature, we know that when information comes in, the work by Gilbert, prima facie, we take it for the reality. We take it first for the truth. And this mental models will be then retained in memory, and they will be retained in memory, and you need to have really disconfirming evidence so that it is actually these mental representations are left, so they stick around. So the motivational, the desire for certainty, plus the cognitive components would speak for the fact that we are all kind of plagued by misplaced certainty. So it should be prevalent, it should be spanning valence, meaning for positive contents, for negative contents, and it should span across different life domains, as we saw in the religious domain, in the interpersonal domain, the achievement domain. So the first study set then had 3 studies, and we just tested the differences to the other epistemic structure and the prevalence and the valence and the different life domains, whether it is actually a phenomenon that we should be concerned about. So how do you measure it? We just gave prompts. And we said, for misplaced certainty, for example, we said, please think about something you personally know, something you have no doubt about, even though one cannot know this. This should be important to you. And then if they can think of many, they should just write down the most important. And then they wrote simply. Now, we did content analysis, and they wrote about anything, about illness, health, life, and death. So I want to read you one of the examples. Recently, a doctor has wanted to do tests on my daughter because there's a small possibility something is wrong with her. I know there is nothing wrong with her, and I'm delaying the test. So, but also from interpersonal life, from achievement, from religion, politics and society, metaphysical phenomena and statistical events. I know the Astros will make it to the World Series this year, but they will choke like all Houston teams do, and then they will lose. So well-placed uncertainty, basically the same prompt, but not something I know, but I personally believe and have doubts about. And well-placed certainty, something I know, but I'm justified to know it. So no ambivalence here. And what you see here is just the percentage of people who came up with misplaced certainty, well-placed uncertainty, and well-placed certainty. So basically everybody came up with what was in the prompt. So misplaced certainty was almost as frequent, and 95% of the people came up with misplaced certainty, meaning we all have experienced it. And these are the 3 studies, so we could replicate it. And then we also find it cuts across valence. So the positive contents would be the gray, the light blue, the neutral, and the dark blue, the negative. So yeah, we produce more positive content, that's as the literature would suggest. But misplaced certainty cuts across life areas. And cuts across valence, sorry, and here across life areas. Others, religion, achievement, interpersonal life, illness, as we said. Okay, and here the difference between the other epistemic structure. So it has more certainty than well-placed uncertainty, and it has more ambivalence than well-placed certainty, just to make sure it's not the same structure. Okay, so if we summarize study set 1, it's misplaced certainty is prevalent, it spans across valence, it spans across content, and it has more certainty than well-placed uncertainty, and it has more ambivalence than well-placed certainty. Where does it come from? Okay, we said misplaced certainty is convenient. Misplaced certainty provides the comfort of certainty, and it provides some superiority. So if I know something what is unknowable, I'm feeling superior. And it spares labor and pain, because if I already know what the future holds, I don't need to try hard to get it. And if I already know what the future holds in terms of negative things, I don't need to try hard to prevent it. So I can be relatively passive, and I can spare myself all that labor and all that pain of bringing the positive future about and preventing the negative future. And that should be even more so when the incentive is high. So if I really want something, if I need something, then I should show more misplaced certainty, because then I have a bigger need that it is actually happening. So in study set 2, we have 2 studies, and we manipulated low and high incentive. So there was a group with low incentive of bringing a desired future about, and a group with high incentive. So in the DV, in the dependent variable, we measured misplaced certainty. Misplaced certainty is the certainty to attain the goal, or if I have failure, the misplaced certainty that some other people's fault that I didn't attain the goal because I didn't do anything. So these 2 studies, and the control variable is always the other epistemic structure. Okay, so how did we manipulate the incentive? Very easily. Please imagine that you have the goal to be promoted. If this goal were the most important goal in your life, that's the high incentive condition. In the low incentive condition, we said, it's not the most important goal in your life. How strongly would you endorse the following statements? Remember, whether you accomplish this goal or not is technically unknowable. We even reminded them of the unknowability. And the dependent variable was misplaced certainty. So we asked them in response to this professional goals, we had other goals as well. I feel certain that I will be promoted in my job, or I feel sure that I will be promoted if I keep trying. We simply scale from 1 to 7. And what we find is here that in the light blue, that's the high incentive, and people show more misplaced certainty. So they are more sure that they will actually get it. And misplaced certainty controlled for well-placed certainty and the well-placed uncertainty as well. So it seems that if I have a strong need to get something, that I'm more vulnerable to show this misplaced certainty. Now, studies 2 in that series is very similar. Here we have, I will show you the example of the achievement goal. Please imagine that you desperately, in the other condition, it was somewhat, want to be successful in your job. That is, getting ahead in your profession is incredibly or slightly important to you. And then we gave them negative feedback. One day the boss is coming and said, you didn't really do very well. Given these circumstances, how strongly would you agree with the following statements? Okay, so though the emotions of other people are technically unknowable, we told them, I feel certain that my boss is jealous of my abilities and that eventually I will be more successful than my boss. So they were certain to blame it on the boss that they had this negative feedback. So again, more certainty, more misplaced certainty in the high incentive condition. The light, the high incentive, the dark blue, the low incentive. So when you summarize that, high versus low incentives increase misplaced certainty. And this is beyond the control variables. So it seems then that misplaced certainty is a way to get head through the wall into what you want. Now let's talk about the consequences. We talked about the phenomenon. We talked about how it can be increased, who is particularly vulnerable. Now let's talk about the consequences. So we would argue the consequences are an antisocial orientation and fanaticism. Why? Now, claimed knowledge is unfounded. It is on wobbly legs. And therefore, it can easily topple. It can easily crash. And the claimed knowledge is like a possession. I already am certain. I already have it. My future already belongs to me. I have already reached my goal. I'm there yet. So I don't want that you take it away. So possession loss aversion might apply. So people might get very grumpy if you threaten them to take it away. Then they might actually fight you, or they might ignore you. They might kind of sort of say, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So they might ignore you. And that also will lead to that they will only like the people who are like-minded. So they will join echo chambers and like-minded groups. And because this knowledge is unfounded, it can be invented, it will distance them from the reality. So they should be more vulnerable to extreme and unlikely movements and groups. So they should be vulnerable and adhering to more extreme movements and groups. Now, if you look in the literature, Margaret Mead has defined fanaticism very similarly. She said, fanaticism is a willingness to destroy those who threaten the fanatically held belief. And a closed mind, a refusal to entertain counter-arguments. So we said, it's fight and it's the flight, the ignorance of contradictory information. And Eric Hoffer, in his famous book on the true believers, defined fanaticism as individuals who take part in mass movements that can be considered extreme. So in line with Mead and Hoffer, we would define fanaticism as aggression, determined ignorance, and a willingness to join and adhere to extreme groups and movements. So in the following studies, I want to show you that misplaced certainty predicts in correlational studies and causes in experimental studies these three indicators of fanaticism. So in study set 3, we had 7 studies, and the predictor variable was misplaced certainty, and the control variables, like I showed you. And then the outcome variable was fanaticism, as measured by aggressive tendencies, determined ignorance, and willingness to join and adhere to extreme groups. Now, what is the predictor variable? We simply measured very face value. I know things that one can't actually know, or I know things that can't be known, and I know things that are unknowable, and we just sort of measured them on a 1 to 7 scale. And the outcome is fanaticism in terms of aggressive tendencies. In general, the only way to get rid of the world bad ideas is through the use of force. And determined ignorance. You don't need to listen to things that stand against your opinions. And then also the willingness to join extreme groups. I have thought about joining a movement that is considered extreme, or adhering to extreme groups, which is a questionnaire by Saussure. It would have been better to destroy our people than to give up our principles. Now, we had all sorts of control variables. Mental rigidity, among them right-wing authoritarianism, self-righteousness, desiring certainty, magical thinking, inflated sense of selves, including narcissism, and then response bias, social desirability. So we wanted to show that misplaced certainty over and above would predict fanaticism. Only then it would be valid. And what you find here is a summary of 6 and 5 studies in these meta-analytic R estimates. There's a pretty substantial relationship between misplaced certainty and these indicators of fanaticism, reaching from 0.29 to 0.40. So meaning that misplaced certainty predicts these 3 indicators of fanaticism. Even when controlling for these third variables, which I just showed you. So over and above these third variables. And what is interesting, what we found is that misplaced certainty actually relates to feeling certain, to mental rigidity, rather than to the desire to feel certain, meaning misplaced certainty effectively supplies people with that certainty. Now, what about the experimental studies? We reasoned it would actually not only predict, but causally heighten fanaticism. And then we reasoned that this might be actually mediated by these feelings of being threatened. Remember, possession, loss, aversion? So I'm threatened that somebody takes away my certainty. And if that's the case, these fanatical indicators should be mediated, should be caused by a threat that in turn is caused by misplaced certainty. And then in study 3 of that study set, we also reasoned that we don't want to only measure fanaticism in terms of self-report. We want to show that actually people have mental representations of themselves in terms of looking fanatic. And I will show you that in a minute. So study set 4 has 3 studies, 2 studies, self-report, 1 study in terms of a mental representation of the self. The independent variables are the epistemic structure, 3 conditions: misplaced certainty, well-placed uncertainty, well-placed certainty. And the dependent variables are fanaticism, and then in study 3, fanatical self-view. How did we manipulate? Misplaced certainty condition, we simply said there are things in life that we feel like we know are true and are certain about. What is something important that you know and are certain about in life? Please write what you know and are certain about in life below. So for example, somebody wrote, global warming is real. And then we said, imagine that most people in the world claim that what you know and are certain about is unknowable. That is, imagine that everybody in the world is saying global warming is real, is unknowable. So that was the misplaced certainty condition. And then the other 2 conditions, they're totally similar. It's just that in the well-placed uncertainty condition, we put the doubts up where the certainty was before. And in the well-placed certainty condition, we left the certainty up there and put also certainty in the second part. So imagine that most people in the world claim that what you know and are certain about is knowable. That is, imagine that everyone is saying that global warming is real, is knowable. So these 3 conditions, and then the threat variable would be, I would feel threatened if I lived in the above described world, if everybody was saying what we just heard. I would feel like I'm being boxed into a corner. I would feel like people are out to get me. So this is feeling threatened. And then the aggression, very simple. 3 items: I would aggress, I would ignore other people for determined ignorance and joining and adhering to extreme groups. I would consider being part of an extreme group or movement in support of it. Not at all agree, strongly agree. So it's very simple, actually. And what we find is that in studies 1 and 2, that misplaced certainty actually causes the threat, the aggression, the determined ignorance, and willingness to join and adhere groups more than in both of the other groups. And if you look at the model, it might get a little clearer. Misplaced certainty causes threat, being threatened. And this being threatened then predicts fanaticism. Now, in study 1, the link between threat and fanaticism is still predictive. So what we did is, in order to really show that both of these links, from misplaced certainty to threat and from threat to fanaticism, are causal, we just, in study 2, reduced the threat. So we asked people to reappraise the threat. So the threat was gone. And then actually the relationship between misplaced certainty and fanaticism was also reduced. So it is a causal mediation. So the problem really is misplaced certainty through this ambivalence, through this possession loss aversion, will cause the threat, and the threat then is the culprit for fanaticism. Now, study 3 is basically the same design, but the dependent variable we didn't measure by self-report, but by reverse correlations. Now, reverse correlations is a psychological paradigm which allows you to visualize participants' mental representations of themselves. And usually it is used for mental representations of people of different gender, or different race, or different background. But we used it of measuring or visualization the mental representations of people themselves. And we put them in the three conditions: misplaced certainty, well-placed uncertainty, well-placed certainty. And then we simply measured how they mentally represented themselves. And how you do that is you give people blurred faces to evaluate. And each of the participants got 100 of such blurred faces where they needed to decide which face they would look like more. 2 blurred faces, and you just need to decide, who do I look like more? And they're all blurred. And what you end up then is with, if you have 100 participants, which we had in each condition, with 10,000 of these choices. And out of these 10,000 choices, you make pictures. And these are the pictures. So you have pictures that are a composite of all the people in the well-placed certainty condition on the left side. Pretty friendly guy, no? Well-placed uncertainty is in the middle, and misplaced certainty is on the right. And then we simply asked 500 other participants how they would rate these faces in terms of fanaticism, aggression, determined ignorance, and joining extreme groups. And what we find is that the right face, the face of the participants who were placed in the misplaced certainty condition, that they were rated more fanatical by the independent sample of raters. So that's where we can say it's not only self-report, but it is also how people represent themselves. They look more fanatical. Okay, let's summarize. Misplaced certainty produced more fanaticism than well-placed uncertainty and well-placed certainty. The effect was causally mediated by being threatened, and we can measure that not only with respect to self-report, but also in terms of how people mentally represent themselves. Let's round up. The function of misplaced certainty is to allow people to establish certainty, the comfort of certainty, to avoid the effort and the pain of actually implementing certainty in real life. So it's an easy way out. It's a very convenient shortcut, a mental shortcut. The costs of misplaced certainty is fanaticism in the form of aggression, determined ignorance, and joining like-minded extreme groups. And it is specifically this ambivalence which makes people feeling threatened, and they predict then these variables of fanaticism. Now, can we generalize this across world settings? Well, we can't generalize it, but we can show that we also find it in real world settings. And this is just a visualization of what we kind of mean with misplaced certainty. So that is a picture from an article in the New York Times last year, where they made a picture of a pro-Trump demonstration. And she's saying, Trump won. I know it, and you know it. Okay, we did studies in the political area. So it predicts fanaticism in the political domain. So for example, with the 2020 election, the more people had entertained misplaced certainty, the more they ignored dissenting information, the more they were willing to punish people from the other side, and that applies to the Biden and to the Trump side. The more they claimed that the election was rigged in case the candidate lost directly after the election when it still wasn't clear who won. And then when it became clear that Trump had lost, among Trump supporters, they supported Capitol insurrectionists. So they supported the 6th of January insurrectionists. In the health domain, we did pandemic studies, and the more misplaced certainty, the more people ignored relevant health information and endangered others in terms of a lack of social distancing and also a lack of mask wearing. In the moral domain, we did studies with pro-life and pro-choice regarding abortion supporters, and we find that they are willing to punish the other side, and they are ready to join more extreme groups. And then among anti-vaxxers, they are ready to engage in fanatical behavior, including anti-vaccine missionary activities and including to refusal to get vaccinated yourself. And then finally, in the religious domain, we did a study with a relatively small n, but these studies are difficult to look at Christian groups who are classified as more fanatical versus less fanatical. And we looked at Jehovah's Witnesses, and we found more misplaced certainty in Jehovah's Witnesses than in parallel Christian religious groups. Okay, what do we do now? We look at misplaced certainty in the context of conspiracy theories, because we argue that the effects of conspiracy theories, the harmful effects of conspiracy theories, should be especially there, especially existing if these conspiracy theories are held with misplaced certainty. Then we look at who, where, and when are people vulnerable to fall into misplaced certainty? When are they vulnerable to actually embrace misplaced certainty information and misplaced certainty people and misplaced certainty messages? Then we look at the other three epistemic structures. I told you the two well-placed and then the misplaced uncertainty condition. And then finally, an important way of looking at misplaced certainty is in interpersonal relations, especially in romantic relationships. What about if people have misplaced certainty with respect to the partner or with respect to any kind of conviction? How does this play out in interpersonal relationships? And then finally, the most important question is, how can we create interventions to reduce misplaced certainty? Not only to reduce the threat, which we did, but how to reduce the phenomena of misplaced certainty so that people get less vulnerable to fanaticism. So what did I do? I showed you the phenomena of misplaced certainty, that its prevalence spans across valence and content. I looked at the origins, and we found high incentive makes people vulnerable. And then finally, I looked at the consequences. Fanaticism with feelings of threat are the most dangerous consequences. And we find that in the lab, and we find it in real world settings. So now all is left is thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being so open for a very new field of research. Thanks a lot. Totally. Yes, yes, yes.
Tenemos un par de minutos para preguntas, si es que alguien quiere comentar algo a la doctora.
Thank you for the great presentation. And it's a very, very interesting topic. And actually, when you were talking about the applications, I was thinking about my business experience. And I think it would really apply also to the business context. And I was thinking about leadership styles, no, also related to this misplaced certainty, because for sure I could see this misplaced certainty and uncertainty in the business context. But my question is more related to the incentive, because you mentioned the high and low incentive. I wanted to ask if you also looked at the more internal versus external incentive, when I'm like highly motivated because the goal is for me, versus it's more something the external reward that I get it's related really to fanaticism when you, as you mentioned, because it's, I would see this external reward also in the religious context or business context. I don't know if I made myself clear. So,
first of all, this leadership idea is a great idea because people who are in leadership positions, especially in autocratic structures, they don't get any opposition. So they more and more put themselves into a kind of isolate cocon. And that is super dangerous. And the more they are in this misplaced certainty world, the more echo chamber they have, and the more dangerous it gets. So that speaks very much for a non-autocratic leadership style. And it would be fascinating to look at businesses and misplaced certainty in businesses. So thank you for that hint. With respect to internal and external incentive structures, we didn't vary that, and we don't know. I mean, there are these models. When do external incentives actually then get so much internalized that they are actually attractive for you? Now, if you have a very strong external incentive, but they are part of your identity or so, then it's getting internal again. So the only thing we know is if it's very important to you. We don't have additional data in terms of external versus internal, etc. It's a great idea. Thank you.
Si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta en español, con gusto les ayudamos a traducir en caso de que quieran participar. Ya, creo que ya tenemos una pregunta. Te van a pasar el micrófono. Try my best, please.
Okay, so as you can see, we are all med students. So we have the question, how do we apply the certainty in medicine?
Okay, I had one. The first kind of association comes where I had this little example there of that man who was so sure that nothing is wrong with his daughter, and he's delaying to see the medical doctor with his daughter. So that is a good example where you could say, careful with misplaced certainty in the patient, because that will lead to delay behavior. So they won't come to you. But also careful with misplaced certainty as a provider, because if you feel certain too quickly without the right evidence, you might actually do a wrong decision with your patient. And a little bit like at the beginning when we talked about the international relations, when you are very certain that a person has a certain condition, you might ask twice instead of being so certain without evidence. And then if you're very certain that nothing is wrong, you might actually apply a little bit more prudence and say, maybe there is something, despite the fact that it doesn't look like it. And just to give you an example from a very different area, we have done collaborations with the people in Yale University who are in medical school, and they care about heart attack in women. So heart attack in women, and you know that much better than I do, they come in different forms than in men. And very often, just by being so certain that it's not a heart attacks in women are misjudged as something else because they express themselves in different forms. And because people assume women have fewer heart attacks than men, they don't take it as seriously. And also, the patient-provider relationship might be different, because if you assume that the women have fewer heart attacks, you might take their symptoms not as seriously, and also their recovery not as seriously. So you might not listen anymore. So I think, in short, misplaced certainty might lead you to jump to conclusions too early and to ignore what is actually there in evidence, and not to spare the cumbersome labor of doing the actual work.
Thank you.
So first, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's very helpful, and I think it's very important to not be influenced by how our, I'm sorry,
Say it in Spanish and then.
by our by our inner thoughts and everything about the certain of everything, and I didn't get it clear when you had this, like your scale with your two axes. Can you explain me a little bit more about misplaced uncertainty and how can we avoid a little more this desire for wanting to be sure of everything as we want to uh, as we get to misplace our certainty?
Yes.
See?
Actually, that was very good that you asked that, because it was the last point with which I ended, which was we want to find out interventions, how we could reduce this misplaced certainty. And that's the hardest question. We really don't know a lot about that. I mean, if you feel you are misplaced, then I would say, as a practical, but I don't have data on that, as a practical advice, ask twice. Always ask twice. So if you feel very certain and you feel up, but I don't really know, ask twice and look twice and get yourself into the pain of looking twice and not being lazy. I think that is one way to avoid it, because the temptation of falling into misplaced certainty is very, very high. It's so nice to be certain, and it's so good not to work for the certainty. And therefore, I think if you have as a little kind of reminder, when you feel you are too certain about that something will happen or that something will not happen or that something is right or something is wrong, just ask twice.
Can you explain a bit more what you mean by asking twice?
Can I be really certain about that? What is the evidence? What is there as evidence that this is actually true? What I assume to be true. So where did I get the evidence from? How did I get the evidence? Did I really look at the evidence? What does the evidence actually say? And that is cumbersome. It takes time and it takes effort, but I think the time and the effort is worth it.
Thank you.
La Universidad Autónoma del Carmen. La Universidad Autónoma del Carmen, a través de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Salud y la Asociación Mexicana de Psicología Social, otorgan la presente constancia a la doctora Gabriele Oettingen por haber participado e impartido la conferencia plenaria Misplaced Certainty and Epistemic Structure Underlying, dentro del marco del 19º Congreso Mexicano de Psicología Social, 11º Congreso Internacional de Relaciones Personales y 8º Congreso Latinoamericano de Psicología Transcultural. Thank you so much for being here. And just a small token of appreciation and gratitude. Thank you for being here. Yeah, you can go ahead.